The heart is a muscular pump. We want to look at some more things on how we can improve that heart health and that pump efficiency, this time focusing on what the cardiac cycle is, cardiac output, what does that mean, and EKGs and what they can tell us about our heart health. So some common signs of a heart attack might include things like chest pain, nausea, anxiety. These are the major things that we're concerned about with our heart, having a heart attack. Breathing difficulty and cold sweats. A lot of times that pain radiates down the left arm because there's a common nerve that's shared between the heart and the left arm. Oftentimes, heart attacks are confused with acid reflux, that burning sensation in the esophagus as gastric juices are leaking into the esophagus. And as a wise teacher once told me, it's better to leave the emergency room looking like a fool than to die clutching a pack of Tums. So here's a person who thinks they're just indigestion. They eat the Tums, but it's really a heart attack, ends up taking their life. So take this heart attack signs seriously.
I wonder what unhealthy snack I should buy. I think I am dying of a heart attack. Why? What is the matter? I have pain shooting down my left arm. Dude, you don't even have your left arm.
So your heart's a muscular pump. How does it pump and what does that look like? So this is called the cardiac cycle. Here's what's happening in the cardiac cycle. We'll just start, it's a cycle, so we can start anywhere, but let's just start here at the top, early diastole. What that means is that the atrium and the ventricles are relaxed. So here's a time in the heart where both the top chambers and the bottom are just relaxing and they're passively filling. So the valves are open, blood is coming into the heart, passively filling. Later diastole, that means the ventricles are relaxed, but the atrium are about to get ready to contract. So the ventricles start to fill, but the atrium are about ready to contract. So atrial systole is when both of the ventricles contract together, forcing the blood down into the ventricles. So the atrium contract, both at the same time, forcing the blood down into the ventricles. Now the ventricles are full, and those valves are closing, the atrioventricular valves are closing, and then the ventricles, now they're full and swollen, now they can contract and exert all that force to push the blood and circulate it to the lungs, to the pulmonary circuit, to the body, the systemic circuit. And then the heart relaxes again, passively filling from the vena cava, from the pulmonary blood vessels, passively filling again. Then the atrium contract together, atrial systole. Then the ventricles contract together, ventricular systole. So it's diastole when the heart is resting or when the heart is contracting. So in this case, it means that the heart's resting. Diastole means the heart's resting. Systole means it's contracting. So when we take blood pressure, and we're finding the systolic pressure, that's when the heart's contracting. When we find diastolic pressure, that's when the heart has relaxed. Now, no one should start drinking alcohol to improve their heart health. That came from an article from Dr. Thomas H. Lee, a Harvard cardiologist, published in Newsweek. This is cardiac output. Cardiac output just refers to how much blood is coming out of one side of your heart in a minute. So here's how we figure that out. It's just an equation that we can use. Cardiac output equals the heart rate, that means the number of times your heart is beat per minute, multiplied by the stroke volume. That is the amount of blood that comes out with each beat. Let's see kind of how that works. So here's our heart. Typically a heart is going to beat between 70, 75 beats per minute. The stroke volume is, typically the stroke volume is going to be somewhere around 70 milliliters per beat. 70 milliliters per beat. So you take the heart rate times that stroke volume. Now the heart rate's easy to find. We just find our pulse, we can find the heart rate. The stroke volume is a little trickier to find. But cardiac output, how much blood is your heart putting out per minute? So only about 60% of the blood in the ventricle actually gets pumped out. We might think, well, that's not very efficient. But we might ask, why? Why don't we pump out all 100%? Why don't we want all the blood to be pumped out of the ventricle? Well, if that were the case, it would create a vacuum and an air pocket, and that could actually cause the ventricle to collapse, and then it wouldn't be able to refill. So having that heart pump out is still a very effective and efficient pump. Let's take a look at how effective and efficient. So here's our heart. It's pumping at 70 milliliters per beat. It'll pump at about 75 beats per minute. And let's see how much blood is just coming out of the one side of the heart. Notice we're just collecting blood from the one side of the heart. That cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. So here I have the heart rate 75 beats per minute times the stroke volume 70 milliliters per beat. I got over 5 liters of blood. So think 2-liter bottle, think another 2-liter bottle of soda, think a 1-liter bottle beside it, and then think of a little bit more, like half a can. That's a lot of blood coming out in just 1 minute. The heart can be a very effective pump when it comes to circulating your blood. So what causes the heart to beat? Those signals are electrical impulses that come from the SA node and the AV node. So the SA node, the sinoatrial node, so here's our heart model. This is the atrium. This is an atrial sinus. So up here, the SA node, the sinoatrial node, we call that the pacemaker. It's going to set the pace for the heart. It's going to determine how many times the heart beats in a minute. So it's going to generate an electrical signal. We call it the pacemaker. If the pacemaker is generating a signal where the heart is beating rapidly, we call that tachycardia. So like your tachometer in your car engine is registering how many RPMs per minute. The tachycardia means fast or rapid heartbeat. Bradycardia means it's slow. Now, sometimes that's a bad thing. Sometimes bradycardia is slow. Sometimes tachycardia, too fast, is bad. Sometimes it's a good thing. Like for athletes who have a really super strong heart, they're getting the same cardiac output. They're getting the same cardiac output as a normal person, but their heart rate's much lower. So they lower their heart rate from, let's say, 75 down to 50 or 60. So their stroke volume goes up. So they're doing the same amount of work as the rest of us, but it takes a lot less effort because their heart's so strong. Their heart rate goes down, the stroke volume goes up. So that would be a good example of bradycardia. Sometimes there's some bad examples where bradycardia is not a good thing. Tachycardia is not a good thing unless, of course, you're exercising and you want your heart rate to go up to help strengthen your heart. In fact, your maximum heart rate is around 220 minus your age. All right, so as you get older, your maximum heart rate kind of goes down a little bit. But when you're exercising, you want to push yourself to a point where you're exercising at around 75% of that maximum heart rate. That's too slow, a slow heartbeat. What's tachycardia? That's the opposite then, a heart rate too fast, over 100 beats per minute. If the heart's beating rapidly, over 100 beats per minute. So the problem is that it doesn't have a chance to fill. You don't get that long resting period where it's passively filling with blood. So without that, the stroke volume goes way down, and your body suffers as a result. If cardiac is a little math problem for you, if cardiac output is 5,000 milliliters, and the heart rate is 50 beats per minute, what's the stroke volume? So we'll work that little math problem out in your head for a second. You'll find that the stroke volume is around 100 milliliters per beat. As the heart rate goes down, the stroke volume goes up to still get around that 5 liters per minute. Intrinsic conduction system is just the electrical impulses that travel around the heart that help control the heart beat. It all starts with the SA node. The SA node is going to signal the atrium to contract. So that electrical impulse is going to travel around the atrium to the AV node, the atrioventricular node, in between the atrium and the ventricles. Once the AV node gets the signal, it'll travel through the septum here and around the ventricles, causing them to contract, the ventricles to contract. Let's see how that works. Notice how the electrical impulse starts here at the SA node, travels around the atrium contracts, then it signals the AV node. The AV node sends the signals around the ventricles, causing the ventricles to contract. The atrium contracts, the ventricles contract. Notice though that it's triggered by this electrical impulse. So which node sets the heart rate? Well, we call it the pacemaker, the SA node. That's what sets the pace, the lub-dub, lub-dub. What's the heart rate? How many times does it beat per minute? The AV node gets its name because it's in between the atrium and the ventricles. So notice again, the SA node sends a signal around the atrium contract together. Then the AV node sends a signal around the ventricles, then the ventricles contract together. Electrical impulse spreading through the atrium, and it raises this question, like just because there's electrical impulses traveling around the heart signaling the muscles to contract, does it mean that the muscles will contract? And interestingly, the answer is no. You could have a person who's dead, but their electrical conduction system, their intrinsic conduction system is still working, so they're still sending electrical impulses around their heart. It's just that the cardiac muscle is not responding. So just because you're getting an electrical read doesn't necessarily mean that the heart muscle is actually contracting, but typically it corresponds. So we can use it as a measure of how your heart's working and how healthy it is based on how the electrical impulses are traveling and signaling. So now the impulse has traveled around the atrium. The AV node is about to get charged up. The AV node sends a signal around the ventricles, signaling the ventricles now to contract. We measure that conduction system with an EKG, where we're measuring the electrical events associated with the heartbeat. So here's kind of what an EKG looks like. So when you're watching those TV shows and you're seeing them like doot, 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 that's the EKG. So it's just measuring the signals as it travels through the heart. So notice when the signal originates and goes around the atrium and they contract, it creates a wave we call it the P wave. The atrials depolarize, they contract. Then the impulse travels through the ventricles. When it travels through the ventricles, we call that the QRS complex. It's very large electrical event and very major muscular contraction. So the QRS complex. Then the ventricles relax, and we call that the T wave. But what's missing? There's something missing in this EKG. What don't we see? We see the atrium contract. We see the ventricles contract. We see the ventricles relax. What's missing? The atrium. When did the atrium relax? Why don't we see that on our EKG? So the P wave, that's when the atrium contract. QRS, when the ventricles contract. The T wave, when the ventricles relax. Why don't we see the atrium relaxing? Well, notice when the atrium are relaxing. The atrium are relaxing at the same time that the ventricles are contracting. So that big QRS complex just overrides the electrical impulses that we would see for the atrium relaxing. What happens during the T wave? The ventricles relax. That's the signal for the ventricle. So let's take a look at how these things are correlated. So here's our EKG at the top. In the middle, we have our blood pressure that we can measure. On the bottom, we have the ventricular volume, the amount of blood that we would find in the ventricles, the bottom part of the heart. So let's take a look at how these correspond. Notice here, when the atrium contracts, so when the atrium contracts, that's going to fill the ventricles. So the ventricular volume is going to go way up. Because the atrium contract, all that blood that was in there gets pushed into the ventricles. They start to swell with that new blood that's rushing into the ventricle, being pushed into there. So the ventricular volume goes way up. Then the ventricles are going to contract. So we have this major event where the ventricles contract. When that does, we have this huge QRS complex, the electrical conduction system. Here, the blood pressure goes way up. So the ventricular pressure goes way up because we're squeezing the heart to push all that blood out. The aortic pressure goes way up because the aorta gets this big bulge of blood going through it. All right? The atrial pressure, of course, goes down because now the atrium are empty. And the ventricular volume goes way down because now the ventricles are empty. So let's kind of see how these all correspond to. Together. So let's watch how they correspond together. Notice the electrical vents across the top and how they correspond with the pressure in the middle and the ventricular volume, the amount of blood in the ventricles. Keep your eye on the heart diagram or the heart animation. You can see the blood moving through the atrium, moving through the aorta, and how that increases the aortic pressure. So we measure that blood pressure. We're measuring that 120, when all that blood comes out into the aorta, over 80 when it drops a little bit. So here again is an EKG. Notice what's happening here. At the P wave, the atrium are contracting. Then at the QRS complex, the ventricles contract. At the T wave, the ventricles relax. So when we look at EKGs, here's some things we want to focus on. The rate. How fast is the heart beating? What's the heart rate? So we can tell that from the EKG lines. The rhythm. Is the SA node like setting the pace? Are the heartbeats regular, one right after the other, or are they kind of spaced out in a way? The hypertrophy. Are any of these lines too tall? Like, are any of the events too big? Or blocks? Is there too much distance between these events because it's taking too long for the electrical impulse to get to those muscle cells, so the event takes longer than it should, so there's something blocking it. So let's take a look. Here at the top is a normal EKG. All right, so this is a normal EKG. We can measure the heart rate by the regular intervals. And here's a little quick and dirty trick. It goes like, you just go in half. The first line, 300. So if that QRS was here, then that heart rate would be 300 beats per minute. If it were here, it would be around 150. If it were here, it would be around 75. So here's a heart rate that's around 75 beats per minute. Rate. Then we want to look at rhythm. Are they spaced regular intervals apart? And it looks like they are. So the rhythm seems pretty natural. There's no like bop, 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 but the rhythm's very regular. Then we want to look for hypertrophy. Are any of these waves elongated or too tall? So hypertrophy and blocks. Are any of them too tall? That would be hypertrophy. Or any of them too elongated? That would be blocks. And all these look like they're normal length. So it's a normal EKG. Here, we notice right away that the rate is really fast. Tachycardia almost. Really fast. Very rapid heart rate. So there's something wrong with the SA node. It's not setting the pace. It's not giving that regular normal heart rate. It's way faster than it should be. Down here we notice there's a tall P wave, which tells us that the atrium are contracting with too much strength. There is hypertrophy. There's too much electrical event happening to get the atrium to contract. Right? So the wave is really high. So there's something wrong in the atrium. So we can kind of identify where some of these things are by looking at rate, rhythm, hypertrophy, and blocks, whether they're too long. So what does the P wave show? That shows us when the atrium contracts. Cardiac output equals stroke volume times heart rate. What happens during diastole? The heart rest. Which node is the pacemaker? The SA node. That sets the pace for the heart. 4 things to look for on the EKG for those of us who are just studying this on a 101 level. Rate, rhythm, hypertrophy, and blocks. How fast is that heart beating? Is it beating at a regular rhythm? Are the waves a normal height? Are they too tall? And are they elongated, or are they a normal width? And how would an EKG tell you that the atria is too muscular? Or would you have a tall P wave? What would that say?
My cardiac output is better than yours. I put out 6 liters per minute. You think you are cool because you have a good cardiac output? I have a near perfect EKG, which means I have a near perfect heart. You can take the EKG and eat it. I am putting up a heart rate of 50 beats per minute. That is why they call me Brady. Is it? Brady. Bunch. My cardiac conduction system is so good people call me Conduit Man. I'm electric boogie woogie. If only you played with the same chanted mod that is in your heart. We will see how you perform when test time comes.